because agricultural CEOs are different than like your average business CEO. And the reason for that is because typical agricultural corporations are often LLCs, which I don't know how much you know about business, but LLCs are conglomerate organizations. They're not so much massive companies that own a bunch of smaller companies. It's more so a it's like one hub that a bunch of companies feed into. So it's like the smaller companies control the larger one, not the other way around. And so basically agriculture has designed itself that way to benefit smaller farmers. They try to do that so that way you don't have to corporatize to be able to compete in the markets. Sometimes they still do, and that's why we're seeing the amount of small farms dying out and the amount of larger farms increasing is because most small farms are actually getting bought out by larger farms. But the misconception starts to come in when people think that those larger farms are what people like to call factory farms. I personally don't believe that factory farming is an actual thing, at least not the way people tend to think of it. Factory farming is a kind of a weird term that gets thrown around a lot that doesn't exactly have a definitive definition because people tend to change it a lot. But the way that people define factory farming and corporate farming, they tend to be kind of similar. So people tend to think of factory farming as corporate farming, or rather, the other way around. They tend to think of what they think is factory farming is actually corporate farming. Is probably a better way to say that. But really, at the end of the day, corporate farming is in the small minority of farms. 98% of American farms are actually family owned, and they may be considered large farms or corporate farms, but they are family owned farms that are still somewhat small operations. They may be large in size, but they're small in staff. The actual people who are running it are the same people that have been running it for generations. It's not like it's not like it's 100 different like CEOs that are all like faceless, and you'll never know who they are. If you buy your product from a specific farm, you'll know exactly who the farmer is, who his wife is, who his kids are, because like the farmers take a lot of pride in their work and they like to be known. And so the fear of like corporate farming tends to kind of get rid of that idea that family farms can be corporate too. They corporatize for business reasons, not for size reasons, although usually size has something to do with it. But that's kind of a tangent off on another thing. But going back to the Monsanto issue, going back to the legislative battles and all that kind of stuff, and the issue with large corporate farming, agriculturalists are trying to avoid that kind of thing too. They don't want Monsantos. They don't want massive corporations that are obviously taking over all. Like you said, there's the intellectual property issue that comes into play. There's like John Deere. I actually just found out about this recently. Apparently, John Deere had this massive like lawsuit issue with a farmer who like rented a tractor from them or bought a tractor from them or something like that. And I think he was renting the tractor first, and then when he was using it, one of the discs on it broke, and so he replaced it with his own disc because he like kept calling them, they didn't answer, they wouldn't come out and help him, so he replaced it with his own disc. And when he returned it, John Deere sued him for changing something on their tractor. And so he actually ended up winning the lawsuit, and he had to buy the tractor, but he got the money for it too because he was in the right, because they didn't they refused to help him even though he asked for it, and so he did it himself, and he got in trouble for it. So he won the lawsuit. But that kind of stuff is stuff that hurts the small farmer at the end of the day, because they don't always win those. They like, you have farmers that get sued for stupid things. I mean, farmers get sued for some ridiculous stuff. Like, you'd be surprised the kind of stuff that farmers get sued for. And a lot of times they lose, and they lose their farms because of it, because they can't afford those prices. And so you'll see legal battles are becoming an ever increasing issue in the agricultural world. You'll see a lot of small farmers that struggle to maintain just because they can't keep up with the legality of everything. Mostly because of overregulation. Overregulation is a big part of it, but also because of lawsuits and other things involved. But the legal world of agriculture is one that didn't used to be that big of a deal. Now it's one of the largest aspects of the agricultural world. It's getting to a point where agricultural law, like if you were like to go to college and study agricultural law, that's becoming one of the more popular agricultural majors besides agricultural business and like veterinary medicine. But like, those are like the top three right there. It's like ag law, ag business, and vet med. But it's like the idea that much, and agricultural technology is up there too. But agricultural technology is kind of like on its own. Like, that's not really, it's considered an ag major, but it's more of like a technological engineering major. Um, And so that's kind of why it's off on its own. Like it's considered like agricultural sciences and technology, but it's kind of not considered part of that.
Right. It's under
It's like
more so under considered umbrella, a different umbrella, even though it's
right,
under the.
exactly. Exactly. And what's funny about it is like I've actually talked to people on here before that have designed like they're computer scientists that are not from agricultural backgrounds at all, and they've designed computers for agricultural facilities, or they've designed GPSs for tractors, or they've designed drones or artificial intelligence systems that are used in agricultural operations, and they don't realize that their job is an agricultural job, that they are agriculturalists by trade, and they are connected through a different part of the industry than they typically think of. And so it's funny to me that like agriculture is so expansive, and yet people tend to forget that their job kind of ties into agriculture too a lot of the time. And so that again, that's I get on way too many tangents. I don't
No,
know.
that's great. I mean, that's life, but that's, I mean, but the thing is, that's the nature of the subject, and that's the nature of life.
Right.
Life naturally flows in all these different, crisscrossing, intersecting patterns and whatnot. So no, I love the fact that we're having this back and forth like this. Um, to
But
go
yeah,
further.
so that's you're absolutely right. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, you good. It was lagging a little bit there for a second. But
Oh,
that was
okay. I was just gonna say like that's kind of it's that's exactly how I mean that's just how agriculture is like there's just so many different paths you can go down and there's so much expansion to it it's so easy to get caught up in different tangents stuff like that and you almost like forget where you started but going back to like the Monsanto and legislation issue I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to add on to that but that's I don't know if I answered your question I probably got off on a little bit too far of a tangent but hopefully I addressed some of the points you were looking for.
No, that was good. I was just asking, because that was one of my blind spots, understanding some of the legalese, behind food and agriculture. So no, you definitely filled that, you definitely filled that in with a lot of insightful information.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and then going off of that though into this is part legalese and part technology.
Mm-hmm.
So as food sources are becoming more disrupted, the population is increasing, climate change, whether it's we're talking about man-made climate change or just natural occurrences and whatnot, they're changing. We're expecting a lot more migration, a lot of changing in the food sources and whatnot, and so as a result, we've started to see the rise of more artificial sweetener sources.
Mm-hmm.
We're also starting to see more lab-grown and 3D printed sources of meats.
Yep.
I've already seen examples, obviously, of beef and fish and poultry. Um, what is your, what is your, concerns or thoughts on these emergent food technologies, the companies that are behind them, and then as naturally as different source or different companies compete and whatnot, some are going to fall off and some are going to, get bigger and grow and whatnot. What are your concerns going forward with these new technologies and how they're going to interface with how corporations, businesses are going to interface with governments and with the populous consumers?
Hmm. Yeah, no, that's a really, really good question, and it's a really tough one, just because there's so many variables there. I mean, like there's just when it comes to science and technology, like you can't predict anything just because of how fast things change. Um, my concerns. So I'll start with my concerns. My concerns are as we get into newer phases of agricultural technology, and we're going to continue to do that because, like you mentioned, we have lab grown meat now. We're seeing more artificial sweeteners, artificial just products in general. We're seeing a lot more artificial sources of different types of foods, and we're even seeing more supplemental diets. Which we can get into this later, but like plant-based diets are often supplemented by a variety of different nutrients that they can't get from entirely natural plant-based diets. So like we're seeing a wave of non-natural food. Like that's starting to become the new thing is our food is becoming less and less natural. Ironically enough, because everyone wants it more natural, now we're getting it less natural. But it's just that's consumerism for you. But I'm concerned about a couple different things. My primary concern, and this is kind of tying into the lab grown meat thing, is that by the year 2050, they're estimating that our world population is going to jump from right now it's about 7.9 billion. It's supposed to jump up to about 9.8 billion by 2050. So we're going to be close to 10 billion people within the next 29, 30 years. And we're estimated to have to be able to grow. We're going to need about twice as much food, about like 50 to 70% more food than we have now just to be able to sustain that much of a population. And that's on less land with more regulations, with more environmental factors that we ever had, with, obviously newer technology, which is going to help, but, and also less people that are, presumably less people that are going to be as knowledgeable about how that food is grown, which in turn results in more regulations and more like difficulty in growing food. So like for example, the entirety of the organic market is based off of people not knowing much about agriculture. And that market, well, that's not the norm. We're not basing all of our food sources off of organic growing methods. Let's just assume, for example, that we get to a point where governments start banning non-organic methods of agriculture. We actually have seen similar things happen in smaller countries, like Sweden and Denmark and some of those, like more European countries. They've banned methods of growing agriculture that include pesticides, GMOs, like things that aren't used in organic agriculture. And as a result, like I actually talked to a Swedish farmer about this in person. Him and I were talking at this agricultural exposition that actually happens in my hometown. He was explaining to me that Sweden is almost entirely reliant on imports now because they can't grow food anymore. They've become so dependent on other countries to grow their food for them, just because they haven't necessarily made it illegal to use GMOs in their growing methods, but the general public is so against them, they're basically outlawed. And so it's not like that there's a law on the books that prevents it, but nobody's gonna buy your product, so there's no point in growing it that way anyways. And there are actual countries who have banned GMOs and who have banned pesticides and antibiotics and other forms of what we consider green agriculture that come from the Green Revolution. That was a more recent revolution in agriculture. There's about four generations of agricultural revolutions. The green one's the third one. I'll get into that in a second because that's a whole other thing. Um, but yeah, so I think that if we aren't careful with our literacy and with our education, we could get to a point like that eventually. I don't think the United States will for a while, but I think that other countries might, and that could be an issue because we feed a lot of other countries. So we may be fine. We may not have to grow entirely organic foods, but let's just say every other country in the world switches to organic and we have to feed them because they can't feed themselves off of how little land they have left. That's going to be an issue because organic food has been proven to not be able to grow as much as conventional methods of agriculture. There's actually studies that show that like genetically modified crops can grow up to 20% more yield than non-genetically modified crops, and that's in early phases. So like I think that the technology that's developing is really, really good and it's going to be really beneficial. But if we're not careful with our education and literacy, we may get to a point where that technology doesn't matter anyways because nobody wants to use it. And so I'm fearful of that. I don't think that's ever going to happen, but that's just something that I like to be cognizant about, and that's kind of the whole driving purpose behind my advocacy of teaching others about agriculture, is because the more conversations we can have about this kind of stuff, the less likely it'll be that we'll ever get to the point where we have to basically succumb to what the consumers want and grow food that we can't sustain for long periods of time, and then we eventually run out of food. That's kind of like a floating concern. That's not like a primary, like that is a primary concern, but it's not a concern that I think is going to be one that's worth worrying about within the next 30 years. Over the next 30 years, the main thing that I'm worried about is lack of land. And as we lose land, it's really hard to get it back. Actually, it takes about 400 to 500 years to just grow a centimeter of topsoil. And if we build civilizations, if we build stores, if we build houses, if we build foundations, that destroys more than a centimeter of topsoil. So it's going to take us centuries to be able to regrow some of the stuff that we built our cities on. Not saying it's a bad thing, but I'm going to say the more that we do it, the less we're going to be able to grow back. So
Right. The trade-offs.
right. So
Always a trade-off.
yeah, it's not as simple as, okay, well, when we get to the point where we have 9 billion people and we have to grow more food, we'll just tear down some cities and we'll grow food. It's like, no, we can't do that. Like
it
it
don't
doesn't work
work
that
like
way.
that.
Exactly.